The heat of the tarmac rose in shimmering waves as the transport plane came to a slow halt. Sergeant Ryan Cole's boots hit the ground with a dull thud, the sensation familiar yet strangely distant. His deployment had been cut short, a surprise reassignment allowing him to return home early after nearly a year overseas. He had imagined this moment countless times, stepping off the plane, seeing his wife, Amanda, and their 7-year-old son, Jake, running toward him with open arms. But the homecoming he had dreamed of was not meant to be. There was no welcome party waiting for him at the base. No signs, no tearful reunion. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back early. It was supposed to be a surprise. Amanda's voice had sounded weary the last time they spoke, but he had chalked it up to the stress of raising Jake alone while he was away. She needed a break, he had thought, and he wanted to be the one to give it to her. After grabbing his duffel bag and signing off on his paperwork, Ryan headed straight for the rental car lot. His mind raced with plans as he drove through the familiar streets of their small suburban town. He pictured Amanda's face lighting up when she saw him, imagined Jake clinging to his leg in excitement. They would have a quiet dinner together, maybe even go out for ice cream like they used to. But as he approached the house, a strange unease settled over him. There were more cars parked along the street than usual, too many for a casual gathering. A few neighbors were milling about on the front lawn, dressed in formal attire. Ryan frowned, pulling the car to the curb. The windows of his home were decorated with streamers and white flowers. He noticed folding chairs set up in the backyard and a small podium near the gazebo. It looked like a wedding. Ryan sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He hadn't heard anything about a wedding from Amanda or any of his friends. Surely, this couldn't have anything to do with her, right? A sudden sense of dread clawed its way up his spine as he got out of the car. He approached the house slowly, the murmur of voices growing louder with each step. As he rounded the corner to the backyard, his worst fear materialized before his eyes. Amanda stood at the altar, dressed in a simple but elegant white gown. Her long auburn hair was styled in loose curls, and she held a bouquet of pale roses. Standing beside her, in a sharp black suit, was Brian, a man Ryan had trusted like a brother. His best friend. The officiant was midway through his speech when Ryan froze at the edge of the crowd. He couldn't hear the words anymore. Everything around him blurred into a surreal haze, his vision tunneling on the two people who had betrayed him. Amanda's gaze was soft, her lips curving into a tender smile as Brian reached for her hands. Ryan's mind screamed in protest, his thoughts racing in disjointed fragments. This isn't real. This can't be happening. A few guests noticed him standing there, and whispered among themselves. He heard snippets of conversation. Isn't that Ryan? The soldier? Wait, wasn't he supposed to be overseas? He's back early, oh my God! The murmuring grew louder, drawing more attention to him. Amanda turned her head, her smile faltering the instant she saw him. Her eyes widened in shock, the color draining from her face. Brian followed her gaze, and for a moment the two men locked eyes across the crowd. Ryan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the weight of every betrayal crashing down on him. The woman he had fought for, the friend he had trusted with his life, both had conspired against him in his absence. He could end it right here. Step forward, call out the lies, demand answers in front of everyone. He had every right to ruin this farce of a ceremony. His heart pounded with the urge to confront them, to make them feel the pain and humiliation they had inflicted on him. But he didn't move. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath and forced himself to relax his fists. A public confrontation would be satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't be enough. He wanted more than a brief explosion of anger. He wanted justice, and justice required patience. Ryan turned on his heel and walked away, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. He needed to think. To plan. This wasn't a battlefield where he could rely on instinct and brute force. It was a different kind of war, one fought with precision and strategy. The battle for his family had just begun. Ryan drove aimlessly for a while, his mind racing in circles. The sight of Amanda and Brian standing at that altar was burned into his memory. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the rising tide of anger and betrayal. How long had this been going on? Had Amanda and Brian planned this from the start, or was it something that developed after he deployed? He had trusted both of them. Amanda was the woman he had married, the mother of his son. Brian had been his best friend since high school, the one who helped him through boot camp, the one who promised to watch over his family while he was away. And now? They had thrown everything away without a word. Ryan pulled into the parking lot of a local diner, a familiar haunt from his teenage years. The place hadn't changed much, still the same neon sign flickering over the entrance, the same smell of fried food and coffee wafting out from the doors. He stepped inside, grateful for the anonymity in the small crowd of patrons. Sliding into a booth near the back, Ryan ordered a black coffee and stared out the window. He needed to think clearly. Anger would cloud his judgment, and if he was going to make them pay for what they had done, he couldn't afford to lose control. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was a text message from an unknown number. He opened it, his stomach twisting as he read the words. "Ryan, I don't know how to explain this, but please, come talk to me. We need to talk. It's not what you think." It was Amanda. Ryan scoffed under his breath, his jaw tightening. Not what he thought. He had seen everything with his own eyes. The white dress. The vows. The hands held together at the altar. What kind of lie could she possibly spin to justify that? He put the phone down without replying. His thoughts drifted to Jake. He hadn't seen his son yet, and the thought tore at him more than anything else. Had Amanda told Jake anything? Had she filled his head with lies about why his father was away, or worse, about Brian taking his place? Ryan rubbed a hand over his face, trying to calm the rising storm inside him. He couldn't afford to let his emotions dictate his next move. If he confronted Amanda or Brian now, he might explode in a way that would hurt Jake most of all. No, he had to approach this carefully. He thought back to his time in the field. He had learned how to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy, to anticipate their moves and strike when the time was right. This situation was no different. He would gather information, assess the damage, and devise a plan. He wouldn't rush in blindly. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a different message. "Hey man. I heard you were back in town. We need to catch up soon." It was from Chris, another mutual friend who had served with him in the early years of his military career. Ryan's mind raced. Chris had always been well connected in their hometown. Maybe he knew something about what was going on. Ryan quickly typed a response. "Hey. Yeah, I'm back. Need to catch up ASAP. Meet at the diner in 30 minutes? Chris replied almost instantly. "On my way." While he waited, Ryan tried to piece together a timeline in his mind. The last time he had spoken to Amanda in depth was about 2 months ago. She had seemed distant, distracted, but she chalked it up to stress. At the time, he believed her. They had talked about Jake's school projects, bills, and other mundane things. Not once had she hinted that anything was wrong, or that she was planning to marry someone else. How had it come to this without him knowing? The sound of the diner door opening drew his attention. Chris strode in, his eyes lighting up when he spotted Ryan. He crossed the room quickly, his hand outstretched. "Ryan! Man, it's good to see you," Chris said, clapping him on the back. "You too," Ryan replied, forcing a smile. They sat down, and the waitress brought over 2 coffees. "Thanks for coming out." "Of course. I was surprised when I heard you were back. Thought you had a few more months on deployment. Got reassigned early," Ryan said vaguely. He took a sip of his coffee, deciding how best to approach the topic. "Listen. I need to ask you something. And I need you to be straight with me." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Sure. What's going on?" Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What do you know about Amanda and Brian?" Chris's expression darkened instantly. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Ryan's gaze. Look, man. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. It's not my place. Chris, Ryan said firmly. I need to know. Chris sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Okay. Word around town is, they've been seeing each other for a while. A few months, maybe. People started noticing when Amanda stopped talking about you and started spending more time with Brian. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting Chris continue. They tried to keep it quiet at first, but it got harder to hide. I heard they were planning something big, but I didn't think it was a wedding. Ryan exhaled slowly, the confirmation hitting him like a punch to the gut. So it was true. Everything he feared was true. Thanks for telling me, he finally said. Chris looked at him with concern. What are you going to do? Ryan stared down at his coffee, his mind already racing with plans. I'm going to handle it. Chris didn't press further, sensing that there was more at play than he could see. Ryan had made his decision. The long game had begun. Ryan didn't sleep that night. The memory of Amanda in that wedding dress haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He spent the early hours of the morning sitting at the edge of his bed in the small motel room he'd checked into after meeting with Chris. The silence was deafening, filled only with the echoes of betrayal and the plans forming in his mind. He couldn't storm in and demand answers. That would only give them the satisfaction of turning him into the crazy ex-husband in front of the entire town. He needed control, not chaos. If they were going to suffer, it would be by their own unraveling. He would quietly weave himself into their lives without them noticing, at least, not until it was too late. By sunrise, he had a plan. The first step was simple: make Amanda and Brian think he wasn't a threat. Ryan knew how to create a false sense of security. It was a tactic he had used in the field. His silence and inaction would lull them into complacency. They wouldn't expect him to be methodically collecting information. Ryan's first move was to reconnect with familiar faces in town, quietly and strategically. Over the next few days, he paid visits to local businesses and old friends. He didn't bring up the wedding or his situation with Amanda and Brian, but word spread quickly. People were curious, and small-town gossip worked in his favor. He overheard bits of conversation wherever he went. Did you hear Ryan's back? Yeah, saw him at the diner. Wonder how he's holding up after what happened with Amanda. It's a damn shame. Everyone thought they'd make it. Ryan pretended not to hear, but every word fueled the fire inside him. He filed the information away, piecing together the timeline of Amanda and Brian's affair based on what the town knew. A few days later, he finally received a call from Amanda. He debated ignoring it, but he knew that speaking to her was part of the long game. He needed to keep her guessing about his true intentions. He answered on the third ring. Hello? Ryan. Amanda's voice was hesitant, almost fragile. Hi. I've been trying to reach you. I've been busy, he replied curtly, letting the words hang without further explanation. There was a long pause on the other end. Look, I know you saw what happened. The wedding. He didn't respond. Can we talk? Please? She continued. I need to explain. Explain what, Amanda? He interrupted, his voice cold but controlled. That you married my best friend while I was fighting halfway across the world? What's there to explain? It's not as simple as you think, she whispered. Please. I owe you that much. Ryan's jaw clenched. He hated how part of him still craved an explanation, even though he knew it wouldn't change anything. Still, this was an opportunity. If he kept her talking, he might get more pieces of the puzzle. Fine, he said after a long silence. When and where? There's a coffee shop near the park. Tomorrow at noon? Tomorrow at noon, he repeated. Don't be late. He ended the call before she could say anything else. The next day, Ryan arrived at the coffee shop early. He took a seat in the corner, his back to the wall, and waited. He wanted to observe Amanda before she saw him. Sure enough, she arrived 10 minutes later, glancing nervously around the room. She was dressed simply, jeans and a sweater, but there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. He watched as she ordered a drink and sat down at a table near the window. She fidgeted with the cup, her eyes scanning the room anxiously. Ryan took his time before approaching, giving her space to stew in her own discomfort. Finally, he stood and walked over. Her eyes widened slightly as he pulled out the chair across from her. "Ryan," she said softly. "Amanda," he replied, sitting down. He kept his face neutral, refusing to give away any emotion. I'm glad you came," she began, her voice shaky. "I've been wanting to talk to you ever since." "Since you decided to replace me?" he cut in. She flinched, guilt flashing across her face. "It wasn't like that. Things changed while you were gone. It wasn't planned." "Funny. It looked pretty damn planned to me," he said, his tone icy. Amanda sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't know how to tell you. You were away, and things between us were already strained before you left. You didn't seem to have trouble telling Brian." Ryan shot back. "How long has it been going on?" She hesitated, and in that moment, he saw the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to answer, but she knew she had to. "A few months," she finally admitted. "It just happened." Ryan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So what now? You thought I'd just disappear quietly? Let you and Brian play house while I faded into the background?" "No," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what I thought. I made mistakes. I'm sorry, Ryan." He studied her for a long moment. The apology sounded sincere, but it wasn't enough. Not after what she and Brian had done. "I don't want your apology," he said quietly. "I want you to live with what you've done. Both of you." Amanda's tears spilled over, but Ryan remained stone-faced. He wasn't here for closure. He was here to plant the seeds of doubt and fear. "Enjoy your coffee," he said, standing abruptly. "We'll be seeing each other around." As he walked out of the coffee shop, he could feel Amanda's eyes on his back. The game was underway, and he was in control now. Ryan left the coffee shop with a new sense of clarity. Amanda's apology had been predictable, and though she had admitted to the affair, she had offered no real explanation beyond the usual weak excuses. It was exactly what he expected. She didn't deserve the satisfaction of absolution. Neither did Brian. But now that he had heard her side of the story, he had what he needed to move to the next phase of his plan. The next step was simple: disrupt their sense of security without being obvious. People like Amanda and Brian relied on appearances. They needed to believe they were in control, that their secrets were safe and their reputations intact. Ryan intended to chip away at that illusion little by little, until they couldn't tell what was real and what was paranoia. He started by showing up in places he knew they would be. He didn't confront them directly. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make them uncomfortable. The first encounter happened at the local park. Ryan knew that Brian often took Jake there on weekends to play catch or ride bikes. Sure enough, when he arrived that Saturday afternoon, he spotted them near the playground. Jake was laughing, chasing a soccer ball, while Brian stood nearby with an easy smile on his face. The sight made Ryan's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. He didn't approach. Instead, he stood at a distance, watching silently. Eventually, Brian noticed him. Their eyes met, and Brian's smile vanished instantly. He stiffened, glancing nervously at Jake before looking back at Ryan. Ryan gave him a slight nod and a cold, knowing stare. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Brian to stew in his own discomfort. The second encounter was even more effective. Ryan knew that Amanda and Brian had begun attending community events together, something they likely hadn't done much before out of fear of being judged. Now that they were officially married, they seemed to think they could ease into a normal social life without consequences. But Ryan was about to remind them that the past doesn't disappear so easily. A few days after the park encounter, He heard through Chris that Amanda and Brian would be attending a local fundraiser at the town hall. It was a charity auction, one of those events where people mingled over cocktails and small talk while bidding on items they didn't need to prove their generosity. Ryan dressed in a dark suit, blending in with the crowd. He moved through the room quietly, listening to snippets of conversation. People noticed him, of course. Some whispered behind their hands, others offered polite greetings. He returned the greetings without lingering, keeping his eyes on the main target, Amanda. She was standing near a table of hors d'oeuvres, chatting with a few acquaintances. She looked tense, her smile forced. It wasn't long before she spotted him. Her eyes widened in shock, and the color drained from her face. She quickly excused herself from the conversation and made her way toward Brian, who was across the room. Ryan followed at a distance, taking his time. He didn't need to rush, he wanted them to feel the weight of his presence. By the time he reached them, Amanda was speaking to Brian in hushed, urgent tones. Brian's face darkened as he glanced over her shoulder and saw Ryan approaching. "Ryan," Amanda said, her voice tight. What are you doing here?" "Enjoying the evening," he replied casually. "It's a public event, after all." Brian stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Look, man. I think we need to talk." "Do we?" Ryan's gaze was icy, unwavering. "Because I don't have much to say to you." Brian shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if worried someone might be listening. "This isn't the time or place." "Oh, I think it's perfect," Ryan said with a smirk. "You wanted this life, didn't you? All these people looking up to you. Pretending everything's perfect." Amanda placed a hand on Brian's arm, as if trying to calm him. "Please, Ryan," she whispered. "Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Ryan said softly. "Not yet." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "You know what I think? I think you two are terrified. Every time you see me, you wonder what I'm going to do next. You can't relax, can you? You're always looking over your shoulder." Either of them responded. They didn't have to. The fear in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. Ryan straightened and took a step back, letting the tension hang between them. "Enjoy the fundraiser," he said before walking away. He didn't look back, but he knew they were watching him leave. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and now they would grow. Over the next few weeks, Ryan continued to play his silent game of psychological warfare. He appeared at grocery stores, restaurants, and other public spaces where he knew Amanda and Brian would be. He didn't confront them directly, but his presence was enough to keep them on edge. Amanda started calling him more frequently, leaving voicemails asking to meet and talk things over. He ignored most of them. The more desperate she became, the more control he gained. He wanted them to suffer, not through loud confrontations or dramatic fights, but through the quiet, creeping terror of knowing that their past mistakes were catching up to them. The long game was working. Ryan's strategy was working better than he had anticipated. Over the following weeks, the tension between Amanda and Brian became more obvious with each passing day. They were unraveling, their perfect image slowly crumbling under the weight of uncertainty and fear. Chris, who had become an unwitting informant in Ryan's plan, kept him updated on what people were saying around town. Rumors about Amanda and Brian's relationship were spreading, though few people knew the full truth. "They're on edge," Chris told him one afternoon over coffee. "People are starting to notice how jumpy they've been. Amanda's been seen arguing with Brian in public a couple of times now." Ryan took a slow sip of his coffee, hiding the satisfaction that curled at the edges of his lips. "Good," he said quietly. "You really think they'll crack?" Chris asked, leaning in. "They will," Ryan replied. "It's only a matter of time." The next phase of his plan required a more direct approach. He needed to push them further, but without exposing himself too soon. Psychological warfare was a delicate art. It was about knowing when to strike and when to let your opponent destroy themselves. Ryan decided to pay a visit to his son, Jake. Despite his anger at Amanda and Brian, he had no intention of punishing Jake by staying away. He missed his son deeply and hated that he had been kept in the dark about everything. It was time to reconnect. He called Amanda the night before, catching her off guard. "I want to see Jake," he said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," Amanda finally said, her voice hesitant. "You should see him. He misses you." "Good," Ryan replied coldly. "I'll pick him up tomorrow after school. Be ready." "Okay," she whispered. "Ryan, thank you." He didn't respond. He ended the call and stared at the phone for a long moment. The next day couldn't come fast enough. Ryan arrived at Amanda's house the following afternoon. The sight of it, a house he had once called home, sent a jolt of bitterness through him. The porch swing where he used to sit with Jake on lazy summer evenings was still there, but it looked different now. Everything did. Amanda opened the door before he could knock. She gave him a tentative smile, but he didn't return it. "Jake's just grabbing his bag," she said softly. "He's excited to see you." "Good," Ryan said, stepping inside. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. There were new photos on the walls, photos of Amanda, Jake, and Brian. He felt a surge of anger but kept it tightly controlled. "Ryan, can we talk for a second?" Amanda asked nervously. "About everything?" "No," he said bluntly. "Not now." She flinched, clearly hurt by his cold demeanor, but he didn't care. Before she could say anything else, Jake came running down the stairs. "Dad!" Jake shouted, his face lighting up with joy. Ryan's heart softened instantly. He crouched down and pulled Jake into a tight hug, holding on longer than he had intended. "Hey, buddy," he said quietly. "I miss you." "I miss you too," Jake said, his small arms wrapping around Ryan's neck. "Are you back for good?" Ryan glanced briefly at Amanda, who stood awkwardly by the door. "I'm back for a while," he said, keeping his tone light. "Come on, let's go grab some ice cream." "Awesome!" Jake cheered, grabbing his jacket. Ryan straightened and gave Amanda a curt nod. "I'll have him back by dinner." "Okay," she whispered. "Thanks, Ryan." He didn't respond as he led Jake out the door. The sight of his son's happiness was a brief reprieve from the storm raging inside him. He would do anything to protect Jake from the truth of what was happening. But that didn't mean Amanda and Brian would be spared. Over the next few days, Ryan used his time with Jake as an opportunity to gather more information. Jake, being a curious and honest child, spoke openly about his life with Amanda and Brian. He mentioned the arguments between them, how Brian had been acting weird lately, and how Amanda seemed sad all the time. Ryan listened carefully, piecing together the cracks in their relationship. It was exactly what he needed. They were unraveling from the inside, and Jake's innocent observations confirmed it. "Do you like Brian?" Ryan asked casually one afternoon as they sat on a park bench. Jake shrugged. "He's okay, I guess. But he's not like you. You're my dad." Ryan's throat tightened at the words. He ruffled Jake's hair, smiling despite the lump in his throat. "I'm always your dad. Don't forget that." "I won't," Jake said, grinning. Ryan knew he couldn't let this drag on forever. He had to time his next move carefully. The longer Amanda and Brian stewed in their own paranoia, the closer they came to imploding. He didn't need to destroy them, he just had to give them the rope to hang themselves. The reckoning was near. The cracks in Amanda and Brian's relationship were deepening by the day. The arguments were becoming more frequent and more public, and Ryan was content to let them spiral out of control. He didn't have to do much, just be present at key moments, and watch the pressure do the rest. He knew that Brian's temper would get the better of him sooner or later. Amanda, too, was visibly unraveling, the guilt and fear slowly eating away at her. It wasn't long before another opportunity presented itself. One evening, Ryan stopped by a local sports bar, a place where he and Brian used to hang out before everything fell apart. He wasn't surprised to find Brian there, nursing a beer and brooding at one of the corner tables. Ryan approached slowly, giving Brian plenty of time to notice him. When their eyes met, Brian stiffened. He straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening as if bracing for a confrontation. Mind if I sit? Ryan asked casually, though his tone left little room for refusal. Brian hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Go ahead. Ryan pulled out the chair and sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken war simmering just beneath the surface. You've been quiet lately, Ryan finally said, breaking the silence. Not like you. Brian narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Just an observation, Ryan replied, taking a sip of water he'd ordered earlier. You always used to be the life of the party. Now you're hiding in the corner. Maybe I just don't have much to say, Brian muttered, glaring into his drink. Or maybe you're feeling the weight of your choices, Ryan said softly, his voice cold and even. That kind of betrayal doesn't come without consequences. Brian's hand clenched around the bottle, his knuckles turning white. Look, Ryan. I know what you think, but you don't know a damn thing about what I think, Ryan interrupted, his voice sharpening. You took everything I trusted and threw it away. And now you're here, pretending like you're the victim? Brian's face flushed with anger. It's not like that. You weren't here, man. You don't know what was going on. Don't give me that excuse, Ryan growled, leaning in closer. I trusted you. I asked you to look out for my family, and you stabbed me in the back. The bar's atmosphere seemed to shift as a few nearby patrons noticed the escalating tension. Brian lowered his voice, glancing around nervously. I didn't plan for this to happen, he said quietly. It happened. Amanda and I, things were complicated. Complicated? Ryan echoed, his voice filled with bitter disbelief. Is that what you tell yourself so you can sleep at night? Brian looked away, unable to meet Ryan's gaze. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and regrets. You don't have to explain anything to me, Ryan said after a moment. You've already shown me who you are. Just remember, actions have consequences. With that, Ryan stood and walked away, leaving Brian to drown in his own guilt and shame. The seeds of doubt had been planted deeper than ever. The next day, Chris called Ryan with more news. Man, you won't believe this, Chris said, his voice buzzing with excitement. I heard Amanda and Brian had a huge fight last night. Like loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Really? What was it about? Not sure on the details, but apparently Amanda accused Brian of losing his temper and acting paranoid. Someone said she even mentioned your name. Sounds like you're really getting to them. Ryan smiled grimly. Good. Let them tear each other apart. You're playing a dangerous game, Chris warned. You think they'll crack completely? They will, Ryan said with confidence. They're already on the edge. It's only a matter of time. Later that afternoon, Ryan drove by Amanda's house. He didn't intend to stop, he just wanted to see what kind of shape they were in. As he passed by, he saw Brian pacing angrily on the front porch, his phone pressed to his ear. Amanda was standing near the window, her face partially obscured by the curtain. Even from a distance, Ryan could see the tension in their body language. They were breaking. Ryan parked a few blocks away and watched from a discreet vantage point. Eventually, Brian stormed off the porch and got into his car, speeding away without a glance back. Amanda remained by the window for a few more minutes before disappearing inside. Ryan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He didn't need to lift a finger. Amanda and Brian were doing all the work for him. The pressure he had applied, combined with their own guilt and paranoia, was pushing them toward a complete implosion. But he wasn't done yet. That evening, Ryan called Amanda again. This time, he kept his tone calm and measured, as if nothing was wrong. Hey, he said when she answered. I wanted to talk about Jake. Oh, okay, she said cautiously. What about him? I'm thinking we should spend more time together, Ryan said. You know, for his sake. He needs stability right now. Amanda hesitated. That's good. I think he'd like that. Ryan nodded to himself. Good. I'll pick him up tomorrow. Maybe we can talk more then. Okay. She whispered. Thank you, Ryan. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, a plan forming in his mind. He was going to turn their world upside down, methodically, deliberately. The final act was approaching, and when the curtain fell, there would be no recovering from it. Ryan's plan was nearing its climax. He had spent weeks pushing Amanda and Brian to the brink, and now it was time to deliver the final blows. Everything he had done, the appearances, the cold conversations, the subtle manipulations, had chipped away at their facade. Amanda's fear and guilt had grown into desperation, while Brian's paranoia was spiraling out of control. Ryan needed to break them completely. The only way to do that was to strike at the foundation of their relationship, trust. He knew it was already fractured, but he wanted to shatter it beyond repair. Ryan picked up Jake from school the next afternoon. The boy was in high spirits, chatting excitedly about his friends and a science project he was working on. Ryan smiled, letting his son's enthusiasm temporarily lighten the weight in his chest. Hey, buddy, Ryan said as they drove toward the park. Do you know if your mom and Brian have been getting along? Jake frowned, his small face scrunching in thought. Not really, he admitted. They've been fighting a lot. Mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not around. Ryan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hated that Jake was caught in the middle of this mess, but he needed to know what was happening behind closed doors. Do they fight about me? He asked gently. Yeah, Jake said, nodding. Brian doesn't like that you're back. He says weird things when he's mad, like how you're trying to mess everything up. Ryan swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. Well, don't worry about that. I'm here to make sure you're okay. That's what matters. Jake smiled, reassured by his father's words. They spent the afternoon at the park, playing catch and enjoying the cool autumn breeze. But even as Ryan laughed and played with his son, his mind was focused on what needed to be done next. That evening, Ryan made a calculated move. He sent Amanda a text, suggesting they meet to talk about Jake's future. She agreed, clearly eager to mend fences, but Ryan had no intention of reconciliation. He was setting the stage for the final confrontation. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Amanda arrived first, her eyes tired and wary. She greeted Ryan with a tentative smile as he sat across from her. Thanks for meeting with me, she said. I've been wanting to talk. About Jake. Ryan replied curtly. Yes, about Jake, she said quickly, though her expression suggested she wanted to say much more. I want to make sure he's not affected by everything that's happened. Everything that you caused, Ryan said, his voice low and cold. Let's not pretend this is anyone else's fault. Amanda flinched but didn't argue. She seemed to be searching for the right words, her hands fidgeting nervously on the table. Ryan, I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I hurt you. I can't take it back, but I want to find a way forward. For Jake's sake. Ryan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You think an apology fixes this? You think you can just move forward after everything you did? Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know what else to say. I made mistakes. I thought Brian was someone I could trust. Ryan raised an eyebrow. And now you're not so sure? Amanda looked down at her hands, her silence speaking volumes. Ryan knew the answer. She was doubting Brian. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and she was beginning to realize that the man she had chosen might not be the person she thought he was. Let me guess, Ryan said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Brian's been losing his temper. Acting paranoid. You're starting to see cracks in that perfect life you built together, aren't you? Amanda didn't respond, but the flicker of fear in her eyes confirmed his suspicions. I trusted both of you, Ryan continued, his voice like ice. And you betrayed me. But here's the thing, Amanda, trust works both ways. How much do you trust Brian now? Her tears finally spilled over, and she shook her head. Please, Ryan. Stop. You brought this on yourself. he said softly. Now you have to live with it. As Ryan left the cafe, he felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Amanda was unraveling, and Brian wasn't far behind. The seeds of doubt he had planted were taking root, and soon they would consume whatever was left of their relationship. But there was still one final move to make. The next day, Ryan made sure to be seen at several places around town, strategically appearing where he knew gossip would spread quickly. He visited old acquaintances, spoke to a few key people who were known for being in the loop, and dropped subtle hints about his interactions with Amanda and Brian. By the end of the day, the town was buzzing with rumors. People whispered about how Ryan and Amanda had been meeting in secret, how Brian had been seen storming out of their house in a fit of rage. It wasn't long before the rumors reached Amanda and Brian themselves. Chris called Ryan that evening, laughing in disbelief. Man, you've got the whole town talking. People are saying Brian's about to lose it. Good, Ryan said calmly. That's the idea. They're tearing each other apart, aren't they? They are, Ryan confirmed. But it's not over yet. Not until the truth comes out for everyone to see. Chris whistled. You really thought this through, didn't you? Ryan's expression hardened. They took everything from me. Now I'm taking everything from them. The atmosphere around town had changed. The tension surrounding Amanda and Brian was becoming impossible for them to hide. People whispered behind their backs, speculating about the cracks in their relationship. The gossip reached a fever pitch after Brian was seen angrily confronting a neighbor who had asked a seemingly innocent question about Ryan. Ryan heard about the incident from Chris, who relayed the details with a mixture of awe and amusement. Apparently, Brian completely lost it, Chris said over the phone. The guy barely mentioned your name, and Brian went off like a grenade. People are saying he's on the verge of a meltdown. Ryan smirked. Good. Let him lose control. He's digging his own grave. Chris hesitated for a moment before asking, What's your next move? You'll see, Ryan replied cryptically. But I'm almost done. The final confrontation would take place at the community event scheduled for the weekend, a town hall gathering where local families and businesses came together for food, speeches, and entertainment. Ryan knew Amanda and Brian would be there. They couldn't afford to miss it without raising suspicion. He intended to use the event as a stage to expose the truth in a way either of them could escape. Over the next few days, Ryan carefully orchestrated every detail. He subtly spread word that he would be attending the event, ensuring that both Amanda and Brian would feel his presence before they even saw him. He didn't need to say or do much, just the anticipation of him being there was enough to keep them on edge. On the day of the event, Ryan arrived early. The town square was bustling with activity, vendors setting up booths, families milling about, children chasing each other near the playground. Ryan moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, greeting familiar faces and exchanging polite small talk. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispered conversations trailing in his wake. It wasn't long before he spotted Amanda and Brian arriving. They looked tense, their smiles forced as they greeted neighbors and acquaintances. Amanda's eyes darted nervously around the square, searching for him. Brian's posture was stiff, his jaw clenched as if bracing for an attack. Ryan made sure they saw him before making his way toward the stage where the event's organizers were preparing for speeches. He didn't approach them directly. He wanted them to simmer in their own paranoia first. He could feel the weight of their fear from across the square. The event began with a series of speeches from local officials. Ryan stood near the back, watching as Amanda and Brian struggled to maintain their composure. Amanda kept glancing in his direction, her face pale and drawn. Brian, on the other hand, was visibly agitated. He whispered harshly to Amanda at one point, his frustration evident in his tense body language. Ryan waited patiently, biding his time. Finally, the moment arrived. The town's mayor invited Amanda to speak on behalf of a local charity she had been involved with for years. As she made her way to the podium, Ryan could see the strain on her face. She was barely holding it together. Amanda cleared her throat and began her speech, her voice wavering slightly. She spoke about community, trust, and the importance of supporting one another, words that rang hollow in Ryan's ears. He couldn't help but marvel at the irony. She had betrayed everything she claimed to stand for, and now she was standing before the entire town, pretending to be a pillar of integrity. When she finished her speech, polite applause echoed through the crowd. Amanda stepped down from the podium, her eyes briefly meeting Ryan's as she returned to her seat. He held her gaze for a moment, letting her see the cold resolve in his expression. Next, Brian was called up to speak about his involvement in a local business project. Ryan watched as Brian struggled to maintain his composure. His voice was tense, his words disjointed. He stumbled through the speech, barely making it to the end without snapping under the pressure. The crowd noticed. People exchanged curious glances, whispering quietly among themselves. "They're falling apart," Ryan heard someone say nearby. "Wonder what's going on with them." Ryan smiled to himself. The seeds of doubt had fully bloomed. After the speeches, the crowd dispersed to enjoy the rest of the event. Ryan made his way through the square, knowing it was only a matter of time before Amanda or Brian confronted him. Sure enough, he didn't have to wait long. "Ryan!" Amanda's voice called out from behind him. He turned to face her. She stood a few feet away, her expression a mixture of desperation and fear. Brian wasn't far behind, glaring at Ryan with barely concealed rage. "We need to talk," Amanda said quietly, glancing nervously around to make sure no one was listening. "Talk?" Ryan echoed, his voice cold. "Haven't we done enough of that? Please," she whispered. "This isn't the place." Brian stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What the hell are you trying to do, man? You've been messing with us ever since you came back." Ryan met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not doing anything. You two are the ones tearing yourselves apart." Brian's face turned red with fury. "You think you can just show up and ruin our lives?" "I don't have to ruin anything," Ryan said calmly. "You're doing that all on your own." Amanda placed a hand on Brian's arm, trying to calm him. "Let's not do this here," she pleaded. Ryan smirked. "Good idea. Wouldn't want the whole town to see the truth, would we?" Amanda's eyes filled with tears, and Brian looked like he was seconds away from losing control. Ryan knew he had them exactly where he wanted them. "See you around," Ryan said, turning on his heel and walking away. He could feel their eyes boring into his back as he disappeared into the crowd. The final act was almost upon them. The atmosphere at the town square remained charged long after Ryan walked away. He had left Amanda and Brian teetering on the edge, their relationship hanging by a thread. The entire community was beginning to sense that something wasn't right. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered about Brian's outbursts, Amanda's fragile demeanor, and Ryan's calculated presence at key moments. By the time the event wound down that evening, Ryan knew the stage was set for the final confrontation. He wouldn't have to lift another finger. All he had to do was wait and let Amanda and Brian implode on their own. The breaking point came sooner than expected. That night, Ryan received a call from Chris. "Dude," Chris said, his voice filled with urgency. "You need to get down to the square. There's a huge scene going down between Amanda and Brian." Ryan's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "They're arguing in front of everyone," Chris explained. "Brian's accusing her of hiding things from him, and she's breaking down. It's a mess, man." Ryan didn't waste any time. He grabbed his keys and headed toward the town square. As he drove, his mind raced. He hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly, but it was exactly what he had been waiting for. All the pressure, the lies, and the paranoia had finally reached a boiling point. When he arrived, a crowd had already gathered near the gazebo at the center of the square. Ryan parked his car and made his way through the onlookers. He could hear Amanda and Brian's voices raised in anger, echoing through the cool night air. "You think I don't see what's going on?" Brian shouted. His face was flushed with fury, his body tense with barely controlled rage. "You've been meeting with Ryan behind my back, haven't you?" Amanda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I told you, it's not like that." We were talking about Jake. Bullshit. Brian spat. You've been lying to me. Ever since he came back, you've been acting like you don't trust me anymore. Maybe because you're losing your damn mind. Amanda shot back, her voice cracking. You're paranoid about everything. Do you think I wanted any of this? The crowd murmured in shock, their attention riveted to the scene unfolding before them. Ryan stood at the edge of the gathering, watching silently. This wasn't just an argument, it was a complete collapse. Everything Amanda and Brian had tried to build was crumbling in front of their eyes. I gave up everything for you. Brian snarled, his voice low and dangerous. And now you're throwing it all away because of him? Amanda wiped her face with trembling hands. I never asked you to give up anything. You made your choices, Brian. And now we're both paying for them. Ryan stepped forward slowly, making his presence known. The crowd parted as he approached, their eyes widening in anticipation. Amanda saw him first and froze, her face paling even further. Brian turned to follow her gaze, his expression twisting into one of pure hatred. You, Brian growled. This is all your fault. Ryan crossed his arms, his expression calm and unbothered. Funny. I don't remember being the one who lied and betrayed my best friend. You think you're better than me? Brian hissed, taking a threatening step forward. You've been playing games since the moment you got back. You want to ruin me? Fine. Let's settle this right now. Ryan didn't flinch. There's nothing to settle, Brian. You already ruined yourself. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the two men faced off. Amanda tried to step between them, her voice trembling. Please stop. This isn't going to fix anything. No, it won't, Ryan agreed. But maybe it'll finally make you both see the truth. Brian lunged forward as if to take a swing, but a few bystanders grabbed him and held him back. The situation was spiraling fast, and Amanda was on the verge of a breakdown. Let him go, Ryan said calmly. Let everyone see who he really is. The tension in the air was suffocating. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, Brian shook off the hands restraining him and stumbled backward, his rage fizzling into exhaustion. He looked around at the crowd, realizing that his outburst had sealed his fate. Amanda collapsed onto a nearby bench, sobbing quietly. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. The damage was done. Their secrets were laid bare for everyone to see. Ryan stood over them, his gaze cold and unforgiving. This is what betrayal looks like, he said softly. Now you have to live with it. Neither Amanda nor Brian responded. They were broken, consumed by the weight of their own choices. Ryan turned and walked away, the sounds of their anguish fading into the distance. The following days were filled with fallout. The town was abuzz with gossip about the public meltdown. Amanda and Brian's reputations were in shambles, and their relationship was all but over. Brian left town shortly afterward, unable to face the humiliation. Amanda retreated into isolation, too ashamed to show her face. Ryan, meanwhile, felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He had taken back control of his life, not through violence or vengeance, but through calculated justice. He hadn't needed to destroy them, they had destroyed themselves. Jake remained his top priority. Ryan spent more time with his son, slowly rebuilding their bond. He knew that moving forward wouldn't be easy, but he finally felt free of the weight that had burdened him for so long. The war was over.